Conformément à l'article 108.3 du règlement,
So we are pursuing to Senate Order 108. We're going to go on with the study of the full implementation of the OLA and the Canadian justice system. We're happy to have Marco Mendicino, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. Welcome. And Sasha Bahraman and Stefan Zalewski. Thank you very much for being with us today, gentlemen. And you know the rules of the game. So we're going to listen to you for about 10 minutes, and then there'll be questions from around the table and comments from the members of the committee. So, Marco, we're listening to you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, dear colleagues. I'm very pleased to be with you here today. I'd like to start by saying that all Canadians have the right to fair and just access to the legal system that should meet their needs in the official language of their choice. Access to justice in both official languages is of utmost importance. And today, I'd like to provide an update on the considerable progress made by our government to promote it.
Outset that I am proud of the work that the Minister and our government have accomplished thus far. We have made significant progress since taking government by renewing the judicial appointments process, by increasing the number of bilingual judges on our courts, by keeping better statistics and being more transparent so we can track progress, and by providing better training for all actors within the justice system so we can improve our bilingual capacity in our courts. Building on these initiatives, our government has announced a new action plan whose objective is to strengthen the bilingual capacity of the superior courts across the country. This action plan, introduced by the Minister of Justice on September 25, 2017, includes 7 main strategies. First, as part of the renewed judicial appointments process launched in October 2016, applicants are required to complete a comprehensive questionnaire where they must indicate whether, without further training, they possess the ability in English and French to read and understand court materials, discuss legal matters with colleagues, converse with counsel in court, and understand oral submissions. In addition, the action plan now requires that candidates who self-identify as bilingual must respond to 2 additional questions, namely 1, can you preside over a trial in the other official language? And 2, can you write a decision in the other official language? And in addition to that, we have augmented the degree of transparency by encouraging the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs to disclose those portions of the questionnaire which touch on bilingualism and official languages capacity. Le plan d'action propose des
The action plan sets out measures to consultative committees for judges and for the Commissioner of Federal Judges that should be adopted to improve the information collected from the questionnaires and to strengthen the evaluation of second language abilities of its candidates and to improve and increase the information on linguistic abilities. The second strategy introduced by the action plan concerns the TMF. The Commissioner will continue to play a leading role, namely by supporting the consultative or advisory committees and managing the appointment process. With the action plan, the Federal Judicial Commissioner will have the mandate of conducting language evaluations and to conduct random verifications of candidates' abilities. The Commissioner also is able to formulate recommendations to the Minister of Justice with regard to a language evaluation tool with the goal of strengthening the appointment process. Thirdly, the Commissioner will examine the current program for language training for judges, including the improving the practical component of the linguistic abilities in the courtroom.
The measures set out in the action plan, the Minister has asked the Commissioner to make training and information on the linguistic rights of litigants available to her judicial advisory committees. Fifth, the Minister has likewise requested the Canadian Judicial Council to develop training for judges on the linguistic rights of litigants to be delivered through the National Judicial Institute. The sixth strategy calls for the Department of Justice to work with all jurisdictions, as well as the courts, to develop the means for assessing existing bilingual capacity of superior courts. Here, the government believes that the Chief Justices remain best placed to inform the Minister of the needs of their courts, and it is for this reason that she engages in a constructive dialogue with them and her provincial counterparts. Septièmement et finalement,
Seventh, and finally, the government is committed to also consult provinces and territories to better understand their needs and to work with them. This initiative will also require the cooperation of ONGs, and they will tell us what their challenges are with regard to access to justice for minority communities who also require equal access to the justice system.
its previous efforts to enhance the bilingual capacity of the superior courts, we believe these 7 components to the action plan are working. And Mr. Chair, the results are telling. The most recent Commissioner for Judicial Affairs statistics reveal that between October 2016 and 2017, 997 applications for Superior Court were submitted. From that number, 300 candidates possessed all 4 official language skills according to their questionnaires. More importantly, 24 of the 74 judges appointed indicated that they possessed all 4 abilities, meaning that fully 1/3 of all new Superior Court appointments in the last year are bilingual. The results are considerably stronger in bilingual priority jurisdictions, such as Northeastern Ontario, 71%, and Montreal, where 100% of all of the appointments in the last year were bilingual. And look at, Mr. Speaker, Monsieur le Président, the new Chief Justice of the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench, Justice Mary Moreau, was involved in numerous landmark cases involving language rights prior to her appointment to the bench and has since contributed to a bench publication on the language rights of the accused. As you can see, much has been accomplished. More is required. And with this committee's help and thoughtful deliberation, we will get there. En conclusion, Monsieur le Président,
In conclusion, Mr. Chair, the action plan sets out new important measures with regard to collecting information, training, and cooperation among the various players. We are happy that this plan also meets the various recommendations that the 2013 report from the Official Languages Commissioner set out. So we'll be working with our counterparts from Ontario and New Brunswick.
we're undertaking. I look forward to your questions. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Merci beaucoup, Marco, de cette...
Thank you very much, Marco, for this excellent presentation. So we'll start with questions around the table with Mr. Généreux. Bernard. Inaudible. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all 3 of you, sirs. We started this report some time ago, and we heard a lot of witnesses who told us that with regard to sending the information and training, notably, they told us that there were not enough funds to do this training for judges and also for court employees. In your plan, did you set out money that you could attribute for clerks, for all the staff around the court system? Did you take this into account in your plan? First, I'd like to thank my colleague for your question. It's very important. And it's so important that we have set aside resources and funds to accomplish the objective of access to justice in both official languages.
Is that currently, under the action plan, we have a $40 million envelope, which is over 5 years. And in that envelope, there are two pillars. One is informational. The other is with regards to providing training to all of the role players within the justice system. In both of those components, I want to assure my colleague that the government is working closely with our provincial and territorial counterparts to ensure that they have the resources and the support that are necessary to augment access to justice so that anyone coming before the courts can have access to justice in the official language of their choice.
40 millions pour 5 ans, ça fait 8 millions.
40 million over 5 years, that's 800 million. That's not so much money if you want to train all the staff to allow for access to justice throughout Canada. Another important question I'd like to ask is with regard to self-assessment. And all the statistics in Table 6 in the report that we saw, there was said that there were 997 people involved. This is not the result of a self-evaluation, if I understand correctly. The fact that these people want to become judges eventually, they get to do their own self-assessment. We heard this several times, that these self-assessments don't really work well. We really need a defined evaluation system that's precise. So if I have to self-assess to see if I'm bilingual or not, I don't know if that would really work. First, on the question of in the investment for today and tomorrow, we're working with all our partners in the provinces to look at their submissions
As we plan for future investments when it comes to improving and strengthening our official languages capacity in our courts. But with regards to your question on whether or not applicants are self-identifying, certainly within the last year through our renewed judicial appointments process, the questionnaire does offer the opportunity for candidates to self-identify as being bilingual or having the capacity to communicate in both official languages. I touched on those in our remarks, and the statistics that I provided highlighted the number of individuals who met all four of the criteria which we use primarily to assess whether or not somebody has a sufficient capacity in both official languages so that when we appoint them, we can confidently say that they are bilingual.
À partir du moment où quelqu'un fait une auto-évaluation dans son processus,
when someone does a self-assessment, when are you able, as a government and the Minister of Justice, to really assess whether the person is, whether what they're saying is true? We have to cooperate first with the Commissioner. At the same time, we have to cooperate with the advisory committees.
Both the Judicial Advisory Committees and the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs to, ensure that there are spot checks and a verification of the accuracy of the answers which are provided in the questionnaires. And what we are looking for is an alignment between the answers which are given and what we can discern from the due diligence which is conducted by the Judicial Advisory Committees. But once they are appointed, it doesn't end there. We have worked very closely with the Commissioner to encourage that more spot checks and more training are provided. Again, I alluded to that in the course of my remarks, and we are hoping to see new assessment tools which center around levels of proficiency so that that level stays very high.
Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Regarding what my colleague was saying earlier, Marco, you said that there was money allocated for training, translation, as well as training for those appointed. You said you also worked with the provinces. If we talk about Quebec specifically, what is the federal government doing to enhance access to justice in English in Quebec? First, there's a good relationship between our minister and the Quebec Justice Minister. There's constructive dialogue, especially regarding this topic, official languages, to increase access to justice at the Superior Court.
There is work that we do, which is ongoing, with a number of associations whose purpose and whose mandate is to really ensure that language minority rights are observed wherever you are in the country. So if it means ensuring that there is better French access in parts of Ontario, and I know my colleague, Monsieur Lefebvre, would be able to speak quite passionately and quite personally about that, then we're prepared to make those investments. And the same would hold true in Quebec. And as I mentioned, we're seeing the fruits of those investments bear out. In Montreal, we see 100% of all of the appointments that are made there, which are truly bilingual. So I think that all members of the committee can take that as concrete evidence that we are making good progress to enhance access to justice in our superior courts.
Merci. Comme disait aussi.
Thank you. As our colleague was saying earlier, we began the study some time ago, and we heard a few times that regarding correctional centers, especially in Quebec, it's difficult for some people to have access to service in English. Is that something that came up that you saw?
Has been raised as a concern, and obviously we would work very closely with Minister Goodale and his department to ensure that not just public safety, but every institution, every branch is living up to the commitment of the Charter, which is that any individual can access all federal institutions in the official language of their choice. So I don't know if one of my learned colleagues would like to add some detail to that, but I was made aware that it was raised as a concern.
Merci, Monsieur le Secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you, Parliamentary Secretary. In Quebec, the ministry is working actively to increase access to justice for English speakers. About $1 million is spent every year on projects of different scales. There's the Éducalois project, the Paul-André Crépeau Center for Comparative Law, and the Quebec Community Groups Network. The ministry recently spent $140,000 so that the Quebec Community Groups Network can work with the new association, the English-Speaking Jurists of Quebec, to organize a major forum to give an update on access to justice in English for English speakers. It should be happening next March. So that will inform the ministry's direction in 2018-2019. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you very much. If we go back to a little earlier, there were a number of appointments for judges, 900, almost 1,000, and then do you leave the door open to ensure the bilingualism? Is there an assessment that can be done? Yes, I think so.
You to have the assessment tools which are in place to ensure that people who are self-identifying as having a bilingual capacity are truly living up to that level of proficiency, and I mentioned that before. But one thing that I do want to mention to this committee, which I think is also a positive indication of a culture shift, and that is that the number of people who are self-identifying, who are stepping up to apply to our superior courts, who are saying that they have the ability to offer legal services in both official languages, signals that we're seeing great progress, great strides in adhering to the principles of the Charter, the values which are in the Charter. And indeed, I think this continues to be important. So these numbers bear out a positive story.
Merci beaucoup. C'est très apprécié.
Thank you very much appreciated. Thank you. François Choquette. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the three of you for being with us today for the study. I'll mention a letter we received. The refusal of the private member's bill on bilingualism for Supreme Court justices by the Liberals is stunning and disappointing because during the last election campaign, the Prime Minister presented the Liberal Party of Canada as the party of bilingualism, and that in the past, the party supported a similar bill, 3 times in fact, I would add. And this is signed by 9 university professors who are well known, people who are specialists. And my question comes on the heels of this. Who are the constitutionalists or the experts who told you that it would require a constitutional amendment to have my bill go through? And could you send their memos and comments to the committee, please? First, I'd like to thank my colleague for all of his work for his private member's bill. I know you're very passionate about this topic. It's an important goal for all Canadians. Our government committed to ensuring that Canadians have access to justice in the official language of their choice. The measures taken by our government to date, including the recent appointment of Justice Malcolm Rowe, has demonstrated that our government takes this policy very seriously. Mr. Malcolm Rowe. Thank you, Mr. Mendicino. We don't have much time. I have 3 or 4 questions. I would just need a yes or no answer. Will you send the names of the constitutional experts and their memos to the committee? I just want to assure you that there's a lot of progress being made on appointments. That's great. We appreciate the appointments. I'm sure the next one will be great. But my question is, could you send us the list of experts and their memos, their recommendations to the committee?
My colleague, that the position taken by the government with respect to my honourable colleague's private member's bill was supported by a legal opinion which was thoroughly researched upon reflecting on the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in the Nadon reference. And in that decision, the Supreme Court held unequivocally that changing the composition of the court, particularly and explicitly as it relates to the eligibility criteria, is the main reason why we were not able to support my colleague's private member's initiative. Having said that, that does not mean that we don't support the objective, and I simply referred to the appointment of Malcolm Rowe.
I understand your point, Mr. Mendicino. I understand your point to support it, but I'm asking you a very simple question. I know you're referring to the Nadon decision, but could you send the list of experts, the constitutionalists, because some experts say the contrary of what you've just said. So we haven't been able to find your experts. No one wanted to appear as an expert. The person who came here even said herself that she was new to the topic. So the experts you have internally, could you just send the memo to the committee? Next question now. There's a nice letter from Mr. Sanson that says that he's working on this, that your department is working on a solution, a bill to provide a solution. So I'll refer to Section 16 of the Official Languages Act. It is up to the federal courts to ensure that the person hearing the case understand French and English without the assistance of an interpreter. So I have a question for you regarding Section 16, that everyone must understand French and English when we talk about judges, except for the Supreme Court. What do you think of that? Very important question. I know there's a lot of reflection on this matter.
My colleague that the government will consider any private member's bill which is put forward for the purposes of enhancing official languages capacity in our courts, and will assess the merits of that bill on a principled basis. But of course, we must respect the principles and the values which are enshrined in our charter.
Merci, Monsieur Mendicino.
Thank you, Mr. Mendicino. My next question on this is, will you be tabling your own bill as Mr. Sanson mentioned, before the winter break. On this matter, yes, on official languages, bilingualism at the Supreme Court, will you be tabling your bill, because there's a rush here, before the end of the winter break? I was talking about the action plan and all of the progress. No, a bill on bilingualism at the Supreme Court. Listen, we're ready to work with you, with all committee members, to consider a bill, but at the same time, I want to highlight the fact I have 15 seconds left. I apologize for interrupting you, but I really don't have much time. If I have time later, you could tell us more about that. 15 seconds. No official languages commissioner yet. You're working on that. Who's on the selection committee for the department? For appointing the next official languages commissioner. There was Kathleen Sheridan, among others, on the selection committee. Could you send the information to the committee, please? I will defer to my colleagues on this matter. It's a technical question. If we can answer, we will. Thank you very much, Mr. Mendocino. Do I have any time left? No time left. But could one of you answer that question? Who is on the committee, if you know? If you don't know, no problem. You can send the name later to the clerk. Unfortunately, Mr. Chair, members, I don't know the name of those people on the committee. Thank you. I'd ask you to send the names then. Just another word on that topic, because I agree it's important.
Provide some context. This government has gone to great lengths to improve the openness and the transparency of our public appointments process. And I know that this is something that this committee cares about, and that when it comes to the appointments of important public officers like the one that you referred to, we are prepared to continue cooperating with this committee so that to have a transparent process so that all Canadians can be confident in it.
Merci beaucoup, Marco.
Thank you very much, Marco. René Arsenault. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to talk about something we talked about a little earlier. Mr. Bernard Genetter's questions on the action plan, the $40 million over 5 years. Is that what I understood? So 2 pillars, information, as well as training? Training, yes. Information and training. Could you talk about what that means for training? So training coast to coast. Absolutely.
Alluded to the importance of the minister being in dialogue with the Commissioner for Judicial Affairs when it comes to implementing spot checking or audits on official languages capacity. We have also asked the Commissioner to develop new assessment tools so that we can stay on top of the proficiency of our judges who are on the bench. So, in other words, developing new tools to assess the existing capacity of our superior courts to provide services in both official languages. She has been engaged in dialogue with her provincial and territorial counterparts to ensure that they are also looking at ways to enhance access to justice in our provincial courts, which is where most of the work most of the legal work occurs. It's not in our appellate courts. It's certainly not in our Supreme Court, but it's in our provincial courts. C'est sur les cours provinciaux et les cours.
Provincial courts, superior courts, where most of the work is done.
By which we're using the funds under the current action plan to ensure that the degree to which people can access to justice in both official languages remains very high.
OK, merci. Et au sujet de OK, mais est-ce qu'on a déjà dit?
Thank you. Has the budget already been divided over the 5 coming years between training? Do you know if it'll be 20 million for training for doing what you've talked about, or 10 million? Has that already been decided?
Disclose details from the next budget. I think my colleague, the Minister of Finance, might have something to say about that. You want? No, écoutez, il y a un processus.
Listen, there's a process, and there are many commitments we're working with all of our partners in the justice system, all of the players in the justice system. They present their requests, and their needs are articulated in their submissions. It's a project we're still working on. Okay. The Official Languages Commissioner of Canada published a special report to Parliament regarding signage in both official languages or family court decisions. I practiced law. Jurisprudence is the driver of our legal system, of the way we shape our laws and our society. We need jurisprudence. It's the engine and the gas. It seems there are always problems, especially in Quebec, to have jurisprudence in both official languages. It happens in other provinces as well. Has the Department of Justice made decisions on this matter since the publication of the report to Parliament by the Official Languages Commissioner? Once again, we are in the process of looking at submissions from our partners in the different areas of practice, including family law.
There have been many individuals who have come forward and who have advocated for a unified family court. So there have been discussions around that topic as well. I would simply say that we're mindful that most of the resources have gone into providing official languages capacity in our criminal courts, and that there needs to be additional focus placed in our family courts. And the last thing that I will add is that my father practices family law, so I hear quite a lot about this at home as well.
Mm-hmm. Oui, effectivement.
Yes, of course. Jurisprudence.
Laws, legislative evolution in Canada, in societies, okay? We need to read the past decisions to make sure that we can foresee how we're going to, comme on dit en français, évoluer.
How things will evolve as a society. So what I really wanted to know is, has there been a direct answer? Because witnesses have told us, and I found it sad, that an Anglophone practitioner in Quebec isn't able to obtain a decision in his or her language. And the opposite happens as well in Manitoba for a French decision. Lawyers can present their case in English in Quebec but not have a decision in English, and they never see English jurisprudence. What that means is that in English Canada outside of Quebec isn't able to see the evolution of law and Quebec interpretation of law in English. That was my question, really. That's a concern, a very legitimate concern. Currently, $2 million have been invested in the court administration service. This is done every year. I know there's a request for more resources. To increase the rate of translation of decisions. So that's something else that we're working on. Thank you very much. Monsieur Lefebvre. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'll take up what Mr. Arsenault was talking about regarding training and information. Often, when we talk about a bilingual court, having bilingual judges, we only think about the judge hearing a case in both official languages, but it goes further than that. If the stenographer and the team, the administration team for the court isn't bilingual, it becomes very difficult for the person to be heard. We could have a bilingual judge, but if the team isn't in place, there can be major delays. So it's the matter of training. And then the budget you talked about, that $40 million over 5 years. So what's the plan? What's the game plan to target the funding? I think it's a very important question. We have colleges in Ontario. There's the Collège Boréal. There's training for law in French. There are courses. And the course is also offered in New Brunswick and in other colleges in Canada. So we have the resources we need. So what's the game plan to support these courses, people who want to be part of the legal system and to have an education and training to support the action plan we see here.
Yes, you're right. It's not just a question of increasing training for judges and lawyers. There are a lot of people who support the justice system. It also includes university training, secondary schools. It starts there. I visited in my riding last week in Forest Hill, and there were students who want to study law, so that starts there.
All of these aspects. So it will include supporting initiatives and collaborations with the University of Ottawa. I know that there is a project there. It also includes ensuring that court support staff have the ability to operate in both official languages. So it's multifaceted.
C'est important. Donc, si que lorsque vous avez peut-être
It's important. When you said that the plan will be determined a little bit more officially, could you send it to the committee, please? Because there will be a plan to say how we're going to support these resources. My colleague can tell you about this. Thank you very much, Mr. Lefebvre. Yes, I just wanted to specify something. When the parliamentary secretary talks about the 40 million, it's for the current period. If you talk about the next action plan and the justice plan, we can't talk about it today because it's currently before the cabinet. However, the minister is contributing to the training of support staff at various levels. There is roughly $600 million that is paid to the legal center in Winnipeg. And this center has partnerships with territories to train clerks and various agents of the court. They've also set up a national network for training in the legal field. And you also mentioned the Boreal College. This college has received funding for a study in order to identify the needs for legal interpretation and for legal transcription, because there is a lack throughout the country. So we're studying this right now. Excellent. Thank you. I'd like to share the rest of my time with Mr. Vandal. Thank you. Thank you, Marco. And your delegation. You mentioned two questions. When there's someone who wants to be a judge who says they're bilingual, we ask them two other questions to determine whether they're really bilingual or not. And then who determines if they're bilingual or not? Is there a committee that's in charge of that? Yes.
Self-identifies, then they are asked two additional questions. Alors, en français, êtes-vous capable de présider?
Ask them, are you able to preside over a court in the other official language? And the second question is, are you able to write a decision in the other official language? And the answer to this question is evaluated by the advisory committee. And then, if the candidate is appointed as a judge, there are other assessment tools that are used by the commissioner. What percentage of people who are evaluated
of individuals that come forward and are tested are actually further tested? Yes.
So, as I mentioned, this is the subject of an ongoing collaboration between the minister and the commissioner, and obviously the judicial advisory committees. Once a candidate has been successfully appointed to the bench, there has been a dialogue between the minister and the Commissioner for Judicial Affairs to develop new assessment tools to ensure that the level of official languages and bilingualism capacity remains at the high levels that we expect them to be at in order for Canadians to access justice in the official languages of their choice. So this can play out in practical terms in two ways. One, there can be spot checks or audits, and I've already mentioned that. And two, through role players like the National Judicial Institute, which provides training to all judges, we can encourage that there is ongoing training, ongoing continuing legal education in both official languages to keep those levels of bilingualism high.
Merci beaucoup. On va aller avec Alupa Clark.
Alupa Clark. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mendicino, thank you for being with us this afternoon. First, I just want to make a comment. It's not partisan, but I don't know where to start. Let me jump in here. I wanted to reiterate what my colleague from the MP said, that the constitutional aspects and your position with regard to C-203, I'd like to know your take on that. There are many politicians, analysts who's looked at this question, and it's a serious problem in Canada since 1982. Someone at the University of Moncton showed this. I saw this process that is very dangerous for Canadian democracy. Right now, power in Canada resides with the PMO and the Minister of Justice, and the two together will determine whether a bill or article can be contested at the Supreme Court and deemed anti-constitutional. What happens is it creates distortions in public policy, because even though a bill can be deemed constitutional by constitutional experts or lawyers, we can't trust their interpretation or a future interpretation of a judge. How can we determine whether a certain bill makes sense and whether it should go forward, regardless of what constitutional experts think? If it really mattered to your government, this question with regard to constitutionality, why don't you refer the question with regard to the bilingualism of Supreme Court judges? That would be the best thing to do, to have less distortion in public policy. What I would prefer is for you to do would be to vote in favor of this bill and let the Canadians go to the Supreme Court if they don't agree with it. So why don't you refer the question to the Supreme Court to really get the opinions of the judges themselves, regard of the expert, not, we don't have to listen to what the experts paid by the government are saying. Thank you for your question. I responded to your colleague by saying that we're going to evaluate the merit of each of the bills, private members' bills, that are put forward by all members in the House.
Of their merits. While I appreciate your question, I have to dispute the contention that there's been any politicization when it comes to our appointments process. We have gone to great lengths to ensure that the appointments process is open, that it's transparent, and that it's merit-based. The quality of the appointments that we have seen to the Superior Court have been universally supported. And that is, I think, in large part because of the great improvements that we have made to the appointments process. And with regards to bilingualism, I think you will agree that the statistics bear out that we have made progress both at the Supreme Court through the appointment of Malcolm Rowe, who is functionally bilingual, but also in Superior Court.
But, sir, I'll reiterate my point in English because I did not talk about politicization into the nomination process. I was talking about the fact that in the Prime Minister's office, Private Counsel office, and with the Ministry of Justice, there's what we call process of the charter-proof process, which is very bad for democracy in Canada because you let lawyers who are not elected members in Canada decide on the future of what could be a law or what to introduce in a law or what to not introduce in a law, which creates policy distortion in this country, We should never let any lawyers in this country decide if a law will, maybe someday in the future, deem anti-constitutional by a judge who is not even maybe sitting right now, So that was my point. We should not let non-elected people decide and distort legislative action in this country. Concerning
Just
the
if I could
nomination process.
Monsieur le Président, just if I could clarify, I want to assure my colleague.
Because you talk about constitutional expert, they are creating policy distortion in this country.
Well, I just want to clarify that there is a process in place by which we debate laws. Those laws are debated at committee, they're debated in the House, they're debated in the Senate, and then they're come back to the House for final passage.
But that's not why your government has refused the law.
Once in force and once receiving royal proclamation, they're in force. They're there to be challenged. Sometimes they are challenged. And we have an independent judiciary whom we place great faith in to evaluate and to test the constitutionality of those laws.
But we should not, sir.
So
we should put the trust on the Canadians to go and contest the law if they think it's unconstitutional. You should. And I mean, look, most of the Conservative Party voted against that law. So look, I'm alone on this one right now. But I'm telling you that seriously, to let constitutional expert at the center of government go read Donald Savoy creates humongous democratical problem in this country of policy distortion, of lack of trust to us from the people, and lack of courage and leadership from the Canadian electorate. But concerning your nomination process, sir, it's all good, transparent and etc., but it's not forged into the law. So the next government can say, look, this is going to go to the trash bin. So I will ask you, bilingualism at the Supreme Court of Canada, is it a principle that you agree with?
Absolument. Mais ça, ce n'est pas contre.
Absolutely. That's not controversial.
Be enshrined and to stay for the next government, which will be conservative.
Well, and there,
in 20 years.
We were doing so well on the nonpartisanship thing.
No, but further than the
I take it seriously. Trust me.
Further than the principle, sir. And I saw you on CTV. You were pretty good in French and English. But seriously, I mean, further than the principle, don't you think that it should not just be a transparent process thing? It should be into the law. You know.
No. Merci pour la question. Et also.
Thank you for your question.
To thank the members of this committee as I make my way in learning French, and hopefully, I have been able to communicate some of the fundamental concepts and ideas which are directly responsive to your questions. And I want to assure you, this is a very personal thing for me, that I will continue to work on it for the benefit of all of us. Having said that, I will tell you that this is the subject of an ongoing debate. It's an important debate. We know that there are important ways in which we can explore how to protect these principles beyond the life of any government. And as I've said before, we're prepared to listen to all manners of ideas on how we can achieve that goal.
Merci beaucoup, Marco. Darrell, 4 minutes, puis ensuite, ça va être suivi.
4 minutes, and then it'll be Mr. Choquette, 3 minutes to wrap things up. Mr. Clark had 8 minutes. So I'd like to start with what my colleague, Mr. Clark, said. He said so many good things. I just can't hold back. First, he said that we have to take decisions and not let the justices determine the legality or the lawyers determine their legality. As a conservative, they created laws to make sure that it would be non-constitutional to not decide in favor, and then the Supreme Court says it was non-constitutional. They sent it to the Supreme Court 9 times. So, well, that was the real trash bin there. And then my colleague said, if Canadians want to challenge, they can. And that same government cut the money for legal challenges. So, well, we don't let people challenge the laws and then they just go on with their work. Mr. Alupa, that's not you. It's your party who did that. But we see how you voted. But Mr. Mendicino. First, I'd like to thank you for being with us today. I'd also like to thank you for your action plan. This action plan was is the first one created for the past year, and it will guide and ensure the future success. And this is very important. The budgets that you mentioned, I would like your ministry to ask for an increase to this 40 million for translation and legal translation. That would be essential. So what are you doing to encourage people to become bilingual? That's my question. Inaudible. We have a number of strategies, but yes, it starts with the action plan. That's the heart of our strategy right now.
Education. It means working with our provincial and territorial partners. It means working with the various role players within the judicial appointments process, like the judicial advisory committees, like the Commissioner for Judicial Affairs. And working together collaboratively, we are adhering to the principles that we have spoken about, which is to ensure access to justice, which is to ensure that every Canadian can access their courts in the language of their choice. And by adhering to these principles, we're actually, I believe, we're seeing more people who are willing to step forward to play a meaningful role, certainly in the context of the Superior Courts, as judges. And that is an encouraging thing, because the more Canadians can have that choice protected, have that value protected in the courts, then the more that we are living up to the ideals of the Charter.
Est-ce qu'on voit une augmentation dans les...
Have we seen an increase in the applications of people who want to be judges who aren't bilingual? Has there been an increase? I think, as the statistics show, this has been the case. There are approximately 300 candidates, and out of these, there are 27 candidates who were appointed as judges. So that's progress.
3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Marco. So 3 minutes to wrap things up, François. 3 questions. Are you going to refer the matter of bilingual judges to the Supreme Court in 2018, yes or no? 10 seconds.
Be responsible in consultation with members of cabinet and the government to take that decision, but certainly she would not rule out of hand at any point in time referencing a question which is of national importance. There are tests involved, there are thresholds involved when it comes to putting a question before the Supreme Court, but as I said before, we will evaluate the private members' bills on a very case-by-case basis.
J'aurais aimé une réponse.
I would like to have an answer like yes, but I hope you will tell the minister that we need to hear yes. So I've asked this many times before. Then, you say, as you're working on a bill to solve the problem of bilingualism of Supreme Court judges, and what article in the OLA is involved? Can you send us that information? And finally, the recommendation here of the official languages commissioner, Mr. Fraser, is to set up a process to systematically evaluate judges in an independent fashion. So we talked about self-evaluation. Is that a systematic and independent and objective evaluation of a judge's linguistic skills? Yes or no? My colleague, Mr. Ozalewski, would like to answer.
Commissioner of Federal Judicial Affairs has been asked by the minister to develop recommendations for an assessment tool, which would be objective and independent as his office. And so implementation of that will require money and other resources. And so it's for the Commissioner of Federal Judicial Affairs to make a recommendation as how best to move forward on that recommendation.
Thank you very much. One last question. This sheet, that's a policy, as my colleague said. It's not a bill. This could be overturned. It could be changed overnight. Will this be put into a bill? Yes or no?
Principles in that action plan which are being implemented, which are translating into positive and concrete progress. And I've spoken about that when it comes to the great strides we've made in bilingual appointments, when we've spoken about new ways in which we can continue to assess through spot checks and enhanced training. And all of these things, I think we will continue to debate so that we can preserve these principles for quite a long time. And I certainly hope that the government will be here for some time to advance all of them so that Canadians can have access to the justice system in the official language of their choice.
Merci beaucoup au secrétaire parlementaire.
Thank you very much to the Parliamentary Secretary, Marco Mendicino. Thank you to Sasha Baharmand and Stephen Jaluski. Thank you for your presentation. That's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. We'll suspend for a few minutes before we hear from the President of the Quebec Bar and the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Quebec. I would invite you to stay because we have another important topic to discuss with them. And it would be good for you to hear their comments. We will suspend for a few minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We will resume our work. It's our pleasure to have with us by video conference the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Quebec, as well as the President of the Quebec Bar. So welcome to the committee, the Standing Committee on Official Languages. We had as witnesses earlier Marco Mendicino, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice of Canada. And I asked Marco to stay with us for these first few minutes to at least hear your position on the topic that we'll be discussing. I don't know which of you will be making the presentation. Jacques? Yes. I'm Jacques Fournier, Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Quebec, and this is the third time I'm appearing before the Official Languages Committee. I was there in person a year and a half ago, as well as 20 years ago, when the chair, Mr. Paradis, was chair of a similar committee. It was a joint committee, I believe. And I'll say the same thing I said at the time, even though those who were there may have heard it. Because I want to underline what I said. We have a two-system legal system. We have a public law system based on common law. And we have a federal legal system in which our judges at all levels, including the Court of Appeal, the Superior Court, make excellent decisions. I'm confident of that. But the problem we have, that we've always had, is that the people of Quebec, including its judges, are usually bilingual. Bilingualism is more rare outside of Quebec, and especially with judges, it's not a criticism, it's just an observation. So decisions are made in all areas of federal law, criminal law, other areas of law. Decisions are made in the west from Ontario to the Rockies, in the east in the Maritimes, and those decisions there's a sort of veil between the two systems. There's the veil around Quebec. There's the jurisprudence from all of the other provinces in Canada that has an influence on our jurisprudence, especially in the area of bankruptcy and criminal law, which is extremely important as an area of law. But the contrary cannot happen because our jurisprudence is not exported. It's a brick wall east and west of Quebec. So here we have a way of thinking that's due to our legal training, but it influences our thinking on bankruptcy law and criminal law, and it's not exported. It doesn't enrich the legal corpus of Canada, but the Canadian legal corpus enriches ours. For various reasons, I've looked a lot at what the fathers of Confederation were seeking when they wanted one legal system for Canada. They wanted a unity of thought in Canada, but it can't come from just one side of the veil. Ideas must travel. There must be mutual influence. That was what the Fathers of Confederation wanted. And it's a reality we still don't have today. And what I've been saying for 20 years is that Quebec judges, and we have a perfect example at the Supreme Court, judges from Quebec are able to make excellent decisions. All Canadians must be able to benefit from it in the same way that common law judges make excellent decisions that all Canadians can benefit from. We just want a mutual system. You're the elected representatives who will be deciding, but what we'd like to see is reciprocity to enrich the Canadian legal system. So that's my message. Thank you very much, Mr. Chief Justice. Now, President of the Quebec Bar, Paul Mathieu. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Paradis. You're also a lawyer, and there's the Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Quebec, Mr. Fournier. Thank you for having me. I've been in my position since June, and I have a term of 2 years. You heard my predecessor. Little has changed since she spoke, but it was important to me to reiterate the Quebec Bar's position regarding the future Supreme Court justices. Regarding bilingualism at the Supreme Court of Canada and judicial appointments, the Quebec Bar says the right to be heard in one official language of the country is fundamental. Without the assistance of an interpreter, it's a matter of the equality of the status of our official languages and citizens. Regarding a bilingual Chief Justice at the Supreme Court, I've heard a lot about functional bilingualism. That's the case of the next justice, who must be able to read decisions and understand them in both official languages and ask questions. The Quebec Bar thinks that the next Chief Justice should be from the civil law tradition. In terms of writing laws in both official languages, the Quebec Bar's position is that the National Assembly and the Parliament of Canada must publish its laws in both official languages, and the Parliament of Canada could provide technical assistance to Quebec as well as financial support to encourage the writing and translation of laws in Quebec. Regarding decisions by Quebec judges, I agree with what Mr. Fournier said in large part. Many decisions in Quebec in the area of criminal law, family law, and others are only accessible to those who understand French. All documentation should be available in both official languages of Canada. And so we call on the Department of Justice to work with different Quebec stakeholders, including the Ministry of Justice, to provide financial support to develop a strategy to have the translation of French language Quebec jurisprudence so it's known throughout Canada. Thank you very much, Mr. Paradis. Thank you very much to both of you. We'll take about 25 minutes to half an hour, and I'll ask for questions from members of the committee. We'll begin right away with Bernard Généreux. Bernard. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Fournier, Mr. Grondin, good afternoon. We've heard from many witnesses, and people from your association were here. Mr. Grondin, as you said, money that Suki would like to have to translate decisions is an important point. What we heard earlier from the parliamentary secretary, 40% will be for training and information over 5 years. It's about $8 million a year. That won't be enough to do what we want to do. Mr. Fournier, you've been before this committee 3 times over many years. You seem to be repeating yourself. Do you have the impression that with the current government's plan, if you came again in 20 years, you would be saying the same thing? Because the government's goal is to have as many bilingual judges as possible in its open, transparent process, etc. From what I've understood from what you've said, English language decisions arrive in Quebec, and judges are bilingual, so they're able to understand them, to read those decisions, but that's not the case the other way around. Quebec jurisprudence in the rest of Canada is often only in French. So in an ideal world, maybe all judges in Canada at the Superior Court and the Supreme Court would be bilingual so everyone can understand everyone, but that will take a very long time in reality, based on what you've said. Yes, you've understood my message. I'd like to add something. Decisions aren't being read by colleagues from other provinces because of the language barrier, but there's no influence. University professors teach what they understand. That's what we hope. So Quebec, the jurisprudence of Quebec is marginalized. It doesn't influence jurisprudence in the rest of Canada, and it also doesn't influence doctrine. So they feed off each other. So because of the language barrier, a barrier that could be eliminated if decisions were translated. I'm not talking about translating hundreds of thousands of decisions, but with an editorial committee, important decisions could be identified in the areas of federal law. Yes? In jurisprudence? Yes. If we were able to translate the important decisions more than what's being done now. Now it's really minimal. It happens at the Supreme Court, of course. Translation is done automatically. The federal court as well. But if we had an editorial committee, we could say that this judge just made a decision in Aboriginal law, for instance, where it's often appealed. It's an emerging area. So I think we write good decisions, and unfortunately, these decisions don't influence the rest of Canadian jurisprudence, while we are being influenced over and over and over again. There's something wrong. We wanted a two-system.
Does this have a constitutional impact with regard to case law throughout the country? The understanding or interpretation of decisions throughout the country, are they not, or since they're not translated or included? The big picture and the downside of that, what is that? All cases don't go up in the system, but there are a lot of people throughout the country who interpret case law. We have several interpretations here in Quebec. Of course, they're based on doctrine, what's produced in universities. But of course, these interpretations perhaps don't make it to the rest of Canada. Of course, people are also bilingual elsewhere in Canada, but the reality is that, yes, of course, some constitutional interpretations are done in Quebec in terms of the decisions and doctrines are not distributed throughout Canada. Okay? So now we're going to move on to René Arsenault from Nouveau-Brunswick. Hello, Mr. Fournier and Mr. Grandin. Before I was elected, I was a practicing lawyer in Acadia. I was essentially bilingual. You said earlier there's kind of a wall between East and West. So in my case, it was just the opposite. I'm Francophone, and when I started practicing law, Quick Law had just been introduced, and the internet was still not widespread. So it was hard. I used to read your decisions from Quebec, and particularly criminal code decisions, namely, and bankruptcy. So I understand what that means. English Canada does not know the evolution of Quebec's law, and this is a real shortcoming. So what I propose, how do things happen in Quebec with regard to decisions from the appeals court? Do they have to be automatically translated before they're made public? No. At the appeals court, in some cases where the court knows there'll be a referral, for example, with regard to the securities, the National Securities Commission. if they know that this case will be widespread throughout the country, the court delays its decision and it'll have two official versions. But this is not the case everywhere. Some Quebec courts do not issue decisions that are directly translated. This is not done systematically. There's no requirements for translations. In Quebec, it depends on the language of the decision. If there's one party that's francophone, another that's anglophone, they'll ask us to write the decision in the language of the plaignant. This is true also for the appeals court. But there is no requirement. Today, I met with people. I just wanted to talk about this. I met people from the ministry. There will be translation that will be given to Sokij. Obviously, we have limited resources, and they'll even be more limited. Sorry, I just want to interrupt you. I come from a small province, and we're able to translate things. So I don't understand your excuse. I hear what you're saying. It's reality, but I have a hard time understanding that the large province of Quebec can't even translate the decisions of the appeals court, particularly when some parties are bilingual. So I have a hard time understanding this. I wonder, are you putting pressure on the provincial government to study what's going on in other provinces? There are bilingual decisions. Mr. Arsenault, we have a hard time putting pressure with regard to financing. The number of translations are very limited. It's very limited. So we put pressure for all decisions to be translated. It will be really hard. I'm not talking about all decisions. I'm talking about those of the appeals court. Do you know how many the appeals court produces every year? It's the same thing for New Brunswick, but we're bilingual. 1,600. I'm not blaming you. Please don't blame me. But in Quebec, there's a large volume of appeals decision, and this translating them all wouldn't work. For years, I fought hard for public law cases or for federal law. I wanted to get the means to export what we're doing. So what are you asking our committee here today to remedy this? If I may, the budget we've asked for would help. I would ask for that chief justices and court justices to be aware of what the major decisions are in Quebec. From a procedural perspective, we don't want to just translate for translation. We want to make sure that there is a true heritage. Do I have time left? 1 minute. Okay. CQGM came to talk to us not too long ago, and they said they're very concerned. Don't give up your fight, Chief Justice. I think we have to really look at what's happening elsewhere. I remember when I was a student, I met legal people from Louisiana. Imagine I come from a province that's bilingual, where we practice in both languages, but imagine in Louisiana, and they have a hybrid system. Well, in English, things are different. But we really have to look what's happening outside of Quebec. Perhaps we could find plausible solutions. Of course, we can't compare the number of decisions from the appeals court in Quebec to the number of decisions from the appeals court in New Brunswick. Yes, 1,600 decisions a year. Of course. This type of things are happening elsewhere. But at the present time, money speaks. It will take financing. It could be done easily but if we had more money. But what's happening right now is not enough. And it's a question of federal law that we want to export to the rest of Canada. So it's an official language problem, and that's why we're turning to you for you to send the message. It's not normal what's going on. We've gone to great measures to implement this bi-judicial system, and our case law is, no one notices it. It's not moving, and that's why we want to export it. Thank you very much. So now we're going to move to François Choquette, the member for Drummond. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon, sirs, to talk about a very important topic, which is access to justice and the influence of jurisprudence throughout Canada. Before I ask my first question, I want to ask the chair if you could follow up about the questions I asked to the parliamentary secretary earlier. I want to make sure we follow up and get the right answers before the winter break. We'll talk later after. We'll spend a bit of time in camera to talk about what's coming up. So, do you know how much money is being invested right now in this SOCIJ? And what type of increase do you think will be necessary in this funding? Mr. Arsenault was saying that it's the responsibility of the federal government to respect the OLA and to promote OLL communities throughout the country. So I think it's a given that access to justice in both official languages and involves translating the most important decisions in both official languages. In my opinion, this is federal jurisdictions. So the money that's being invested right now in the SOCIJ, how much money, extra money, do you think would be necessary? Quite honestly, I really can't give you an answer because I would perhaps not be precise. I don't know how much extra should be invested. So obviously, this financing increased in the past, so we're able to translate more decisions. But what's interesting, the more financing we have, the more decisions we're able to translate. Right now, I'm not a specialist on this matter, but are there decisions in Quebec that are being translated? We talked about the language of the person who loses, but aside from this, are there decisions that are translated because they're case law, or are there no decisions that are translated because they're jurisprudence? There could be some decisions that will become jurisprudence. Are there any right now? That's what I was saying earlier to Mr. Arsenault. Sometimes the appeal courts will render its decisions in both official languages. That's not usually the case. Decisions that are translated right now, there are some, but often citizens are responsible for translating this. If they're not happy with the decision, they'll ask for a translation. And the translations that are done are really pitiful. Sometimes they seem like they're translated by computers. So it's not a large number of cases. From what I see, the budget is also marginal. What we know and what we're saying, that there is a paragovernmental institution in place that can run with the ball. And this is a great opportunity to speak with this institution, But in my opinion, as a Canadian who is francophone and who is a civil lawyer, it is important that the rest of Canada knows what I'm writing and what I think. I don't barely write anymore. I'm talking about not just about myself here, but for all of Quebec. Of course, the best solution for Socige, as we said earlier, sometimes it's hard to know which decisions should be translated, the most important ones. You said that there could be a expert council on this. Could you tell us who should determine what should be translated? What process could be used to determine which important decisions should be translated? Now, with computers, almost everything's published. Perhaps 15 or 20 years ago, there were committees, Socige had one, that were in charge of identifying which decisions were of interest. Perhaps we could go in a different direction and have access to public law. Our colleagues who are judges and lawyers it would be nice for them to have access to this and for our university professors to also have access to this. So there could be a committee. I think Socige has many committees of this type. It's not insurmountable. So we have to get this legal information out to be able to make these decisions. Could you explain what Socige is for all members of the committee? It's the Société Québécoise d'Information Juridique. So it's a Quebec society. So Linda Lapointe. Thank you very much. That was my question, Mr. Chair, to tell us what the Socige is. Even though I'm from Quebec, I'm not from the legal industry, so I think there's people here who would like to know what that means. So it's a provincial society, and the provincial government pays this organization. You said there's between 4 and 8 people? No? You have to be careful. Socige does some translation, but it's very marginal. Its mission is to gather case law and to identify which decisions are the most important. They have to identify them and to summarize them. And these summaries are published in specialized papers. That's its mission. At the same time, and not very often, it gets involved in translation. But that's not its primary mission. When I say there's 4, 5, 6, or 7 people, I'm talking about the editorial committee. They read the decisions. And of course, everything's accessible online. So there are lawyers who read these decisions, and then they say, this one's really interesting. So then this organization does a summary, and these decisions will become more important because there are search tools and keywords involved. We could enrich the mission of this society and tell them they could look at federal law, criminal law, and to find out what decisions are important, translate them, and we could export them to the rest of the country. The appeals court could be involved, and there are many decisions that are also rendered by trial courts. In Quebec, they're mostly 99% are criminal cases. And so there are excellent justices in Quebec that could provide services to the Canadian community. Earlier, you said that Socige does summaries of decisions that they think deserve to be summarized. No, it's the editorial committee. Yes, this committee says these are the decisions that are going to have an impact on case law. But that's only at the provincial level. You're not talking about federal law here. No. Could there be an organization that could work in the same way? Because family law, for example, there are decisions that are made in Quebec that don't leave the province. So also with bankruptcy, it's the same thing. Earlier, my colleague, Mr. Choquette, asked how do we determine this? We talked about SOCIGE, but how can we make sure we translate decisions from the Federal Court of Quebec? And what could we do to make sure we translate what we should and allow the rest of Canada to benefit from these documents? It's the editorial committee that could do this. They're influential. There's university professors on this committee. So they read these decisions. Of course, there's a lot of work involved. Many of the decisions are of great interest, but others do nothing to advance law in Quebec or elsewhere in Canada. I said more 80 or 85% of these decisions, many of them are creative and inventive. So if we give SOCIGE this mission to translate these, we would enrich the editorial committee, and the rest of Canada would see what's happening in Quebec. Mr. Arsenault knows also for New Brunswick that's really the case. Sometimes lawyers from New Brunswick are really bilingual, but he could tell you very often in camera that we also have a lot of good material coming from Quebec. Earlier, you said that in Quebec there are decisions and we could have creative decisions. Do you feel that the rest of Canada wants to understand what these creative Quebec decisions are? The reality is that all lawyers in Canada, I don't have sound, would like to hear creative solutions for Canadian problems. Other provinces and New Brunswick don't get to read it. We don't get to read as much of the decisions because they're not translated. Yes, we would like to be able to export more of our creativity. Thank you very much.
Now, Nova Scotia with Mr. Sanson. Yes. So good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Fournier. I think we were at a breakfast or a lunch together last year when you talked about this matter of jurisprudence. And there's no doubt. Do you hear? Can you hear us? Yes, I recognize your accent. Thank you. So it's such a fundamental issue. When you talk about the influence of a culture, it's essential. And I think our argument should focus on that to persuade the federal government or the provincial government, but both could play a role in ensuring that this translation be done, that it be up to date. My colleagues have asked questions about the makeup of the committee. Should we not have different cases be treated based on their themes, and then we'd have priorities in terms of their influence? Isn't there already work being done that would simplify this task of identifying cases that should be translated? Yes, I agree with you. Everything needs to be done still. We're at the infancy of this project. I think it's a good idea, but we're really at the very beginning. As soon as we see some will, once we see financial commitments, once we see staff, whether they're from you or from elsewhere, and we sit down, we'll be able to find solutions. We can find solutions. And you're right when you talk about culture. because the legal system is part of a people's culture. And it makes sense in this bijural system that the culture be going in both directions. Absolutely. Mr. Arsenault said that New Brunswick, they have translation. Why do you think it's not being done currently? I don't know. At some point, there may have been political reasons. There are surely budgetary reasons. And I think that's the case now. It must be possible for Quebec to sit down with the federal government to say, this is what we need. It can be bilingual, it's a win-win. I agree with you. Have there been requests made formally, and if so, since when? How much money? What was the budget? Just to say very quickly, in Quebec, there are other challenges than translation of decisions. Even in the legislative process, it's not clear there aren't any guidelines on drafting laws in both languages. So it's already a challenge to have our laws adopted in both official languages in a timely manner. So requests have been made, but as you know, in Quebec and in some other provinces, it's a matter of budgets. It's hard to be heard before health and education. So we're facing all of those challenges, and congratulations to New Brunswick. The federal government has talked about ensuring collaboration with the provinces. So I think the time is right for the Justice Minister in Quebec and the Federal Justice Minister, as well as perhaps the Heritage Minister, because this affects culture. There's an influence on culture. So there's a real lack in the area of having jurisprudence influencing the other culture. It's a fundamental issue for Canada. So if it were presented in this way, if there were discussions between departments at different levels, I'm confident with the 150th anniversary that there's no reason we couldn't identify the most influential cases and make that a priority, that we work together on this. Perhaps we have access to the action plan that was presented not long ago in September by the Justice Minister here federally. It talks about all sorts of stages for having bilingual lawyers and justices, judges of bilingual offices. So we could integrate that with the issue of the influence of a culture, of a people. So I would encourage someone on the ground to do that. Thank you, Daryl, very much for your comments. Now, Mr. Clark. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chief Justice, President of the Quebec Bar, welcome. It's good to see you, even though it's not in person. I'm an MP for Quebec for Beauport-Limoilou. I have a few minutes, but I'd like to talk to you about the editorial committee you were talking about that could select key decisions. I think there's a certain danger there. I'll explain what I mean. I think this should be systematic. All decisions should be translated. Why? Because there is judicial activism. For criminal law, it's more objective, rational, based on fact, on tangible evidence. But when it's a constitutional decision, Mr. President of the Quebec Bar, you talked about the 1867 Constitution. That's great. I love 1867. But the editorial committee could engage in judicial activism to choose decisions that would foster a certain reading of the Constitution for the province of Quebec. You see where I'm going with this. So how can we trust an editorial committee to not engage in judicial activism? First, this committee shouldn't be led by judges. It's a committee of scientists. It would be university professors, academics, lawyers, but it wouldn't be judges promoting their ideas. That's not allowed in any case. We write our decisions and we sign them, but that's it. Okay, very, very well. So it would be a diverse committee with different professionals. University professors. Mr. Clark, it already exists. There are already people who've made these decisions. It's existed for a long time. Of course, all decisions that exist are available in at least one language. So it's just a matter of translation. And if you want them all to be translated, that'd be great. We're trying to be reasonable in our request. And there's a lot to do. There are a lot of decisions that a lot of people will agree on for their publication. It doesn't mean people agree with the outcome of the decision. Sometimes there's an outcome that's not what somebody on a committee would like, but they would agree that it's an influential decision for jurisprudence. So those people would have an independent spirit, and we have to be clear about that. Yes, thank you. Mr. Chair, I heard a number of people mention francophones outside of Quebec. President of the Quebec Bar, I wanted to hear if you'd heard about this. In small municipalities in Canada, in other provinces, when someone wants to be served in the official language of their choice, in Dalhousie, in New Brunswick, for example, sociologically, the community is being disrupted, and there are numbers that indicate that if you decide to be served in the language of your choice, you're more likely to lose in French than in English. Have you heard about that? And if so, what are your thoughts? If I'd heard of that, I'd be denouncing that loud and clear. I'm not aware of that. I know that here, if that were to be the case, if a person were disadvantaged because they chose to exercise a constitutional right, I can tell you that that person, if it were a judge, would have a major problem, and I would personally present a complaint. It's totally unacceptable, totally, in a country that says it's bilingual. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alupa. Thank you to the President of the Quebec Bar, Paul Mathieu Grondin, my friend, and my friend Jacques Fournier, Chief Justice of the Superior Court of Quebec. Thank you very much for your presentation, for the thoughts you shared with the members of the committee. Thank you once again. We will now suspend for a few minutes before continuing in camera. Thank you very much.